Greetings, I'm Dr. Michelle Pierce Mobley, and today's lecture is entitled From Anger to Resolve. And I chose this topic because my Christian worldview informs my understanding of organizational leadership in the public sector, where I conducted empirical research on the relationship between authenticity, power, and position. Never before in my lifetime have I seen such a dramatic intersection between public sector leadership, positional power, and how citizens become crushed under these warring factions. People all over the globe are watching a level of civil unrest caused by a long history of abuse of power and hate and mistreatment of Black people in this country. Our society has been hanging on this cliff for a very long time. Today, I'm going to examine the relationship between anger and resolve in hopes of sparking critical conversations that move us beyond the dangerous place we now find ourselves. I hope you'll find the material informative, and I look forward to seeing your comments. I'm going to take the next 15 minutes to share my perspective on how events that affect our lives must move us from anger to resolve if we want lasting change in our communities. Our anger must be a bridge to someplace else, a catalyst for change. If the anger simply propels you up a bridge with no plan to actually go across to the other side, then you're just going to be a mad person standing in the middle of a bridge. Over the past few weeks, I've witnessed and experienced so many emotions. I've gone from disbelief to sadness to fear, and yes, to anger. I was in disbelief because I watched a man be murdered on television. I watched as he begged for his life and how a nation watched him take his last breath. His name is George Floyd. After that, a man fleeing from police was shot in the back because he pointed a taser at them. He'd been sleeping someplace he should not have been, and for that, he was executed. His name is Rayshard Brooks. As Christians, James, 1st chapter, 19th through 20th verses, teaches us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. The scripture also tells us why, because anger does not produce the righteousness of God. As Christians, we are called to use skills of diplomacy, tact, and prayer to seek viable solutions to complex problems. This scripture also offers a strong leadership imperative and instructs us to listen so that we can understand. A corporate leader has the ability to listen and understand, and they should understand that Black employees have a long-standing need to be heard in the workplace. And it shouldn't just be an agenda item that gets checked off. All white senior leadership teams, all white boards operating in spaces with impunity, now writing letters of apology for how Black people feel, yet failing to acknowledge how they made Black people feel when they failed to hire, promote, and develop opportunities. How many Black partners, owners, Blacks that have stock options, giving all their all to help you build your companies with nothing to show for it? Our talents, our culture have all been sources of significant profit. Our brand sells, and we know it sells. But our continued presence is a problem because we're either too uppity or we can't be controlled. Our counterparts were otherwise described as articulate and assertive. How many companies actually went back and examined the reason why their Black executives left? It was easier to get them to sign off on their rights to be silent, to not reveal the racist and disparate treatment they endured. How about we start there? Psychologist Al Bandura and his researchers showed the power of assigning and dehumanizing labels. Their research demonstrated how you could make otherwise good people act aggressively towards people based on how these people were labeled. He set up an experiment where students were asked to deliver shocks to other students that were going to be in their peer group. The first group of students came in, they didn't label those students. The second group of students were labeled as nice people, and the third group of students that came in were labeled as animals. The people who were labeled as animals received the most shocks, and the shocks intensified over the course of the experiment. So the next time someone tells you words and labels don't hurt, research tells us differently. People in positions of authority can label you, which in turn will make others treat you according to that label. So people with good labels are treated better than people with bad labels. So if people in authority tell you that black men are dangerous, or that black women are angry, or that black people are militant, this anti-black rhetoric increases violence against them. And the abusive conduct can be self-reinforcing, meaning the more the abuse is practiced, the better the abuser becomes at it. My father grew up in the Jim Crow South in the 1920s and the 1930s. His parents were cash tenants and lived on a farm. The rent was $100, and my grandfather made about 7 cents per hour. He, like many black farmers, entered into tenant or sharecropper agreements where families farmed the land and gave part of their crops to the landowners to cover their rents. And approximately 75% of the black population at that time lived in rural areas on farms, and most didn't live on the land that they lived on. In the 1930s, my father's family, they owned a dog that was reportedly very smart. And the landowner noticed how smart the dog was and asked my grandmother if he could have the dog for his son. Well, my grandmother responded that the dog was a family pet and couldn't part with the dog. About a week passed when my dad and his brother would arrive home from school to find their dog laying on the side of the road. My dad told me that the dog had been ran over and then backed over by the landowner's truck. My father wanted his dad to confront that landowner, and my grandfather knew that if he had confronted that landowner, they would need to be prepared to move. You see, in the South, ownership was an illusion for the black man. Black people who embarrassed or confronted white people found themselves evicted, jailed, or killed. You didn't do anything to harm them or make them angry. And I'm sure as a child, my father didn't understand why my grandfather didn't confront that landowner, but my grandfather was a wise man. He chose resolve. Black men had to stand down to protect their families and to protect their lives. They deferred to power, not out of cowardice, but out of survival. I'm sure it's because they had so many examples of what happened to black men who stood up and who spoke out. They'd find their homes burned, their daughters raped, their sons falsely accused of crimes and incarcerated with no chance of justice. Let me provide you some quick context so you understand the historical significance of what was happening during this time period. In 1900, approximately 90% of the African American population in this country lived in the South. And after the abolishment of slavery, there were attempts to give some basic rights to black people, to lull them into thinking they would be fine remaining in the South. These black laws or codes included things like the ability to marry, you could own property, and be able to have some access to the court systems as long as you didn't try to get involved in trying to sue a white person or sit on a jury. However, these laws were short-lived. These laws treated black folks too much like people, and so they were repealed after 1 year. And they were replaced with pig laws and vagrancy laws. And those were enacted to control and incarcerate black people for minor offenses, resulting in fines and stiff prison sentences. You see, while the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal, it was not illegal if you had committed a crime. So with the abolishment of slavery came the new form of slavery called prisons. These pig and vagrancy laws would later be repealed by the Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation of black and white people. And the sole purpose was to limit the rights of black people so they would never, ever become equal to white people. Soon, the South became a death trap for people of color. A landscape of murder and fear became the standard for black families. The proliferation of racist rhetoric fueled the practice of cross burnings and lynchings. And lynching was the practice of hanging folks from trees by the neck until they were dead. Approximately 3,200 black people were lynched between 1883 and 1941, with approximately 73% of those lynchings occurring in the South. The act of lynching itself was also widely publicized. It was in the newspaper in order to spread fear. Lynching became the new form of terrorism for black people. And their crimes, being uppity, being insubordinate, failing to show deference to the prevailing power structure. Does that sound familiar? From 1916 to 1970, 6 million black people left the South for opportunities in the North. The year 1940 would be the largest departure of blacks from the South. And this period was labeled the Great Migration. Under the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, congressional hearings were held to understand what was happening to black farmers in the rural South. So on July 29th through the 31st in 1940, my grandfather, Athie Pierce, was called to testify before the U.S. House of Representatives Congressional Committee to understand the migration of destitute citizens from the South. He was questioned by Alabama Congressman John Sparkman, who was known as a champion to rural farmers. But in 1940, black people had the option of migration. They simply packed up their belongings and they moved north. But black people are now confronted with the realization that we can't run. We can't move anywhere unless we choose to leave the United States. We're going to have to fix this country. We're going to have to stay and demand justice because we will no longer accept being treated like the help. We are citizens who should have access to the same American dream that everyone else has. Here's an excerpt from my grandfather's testimony, and if you do a Google search on Athie Pierce, it'll take you directly to the website so you can review his entire congressional testimony. My grandfather talked openly about the hardships of farming and how he and other farmers were not given a fair share of the crops they harvested. He spoke about a system of paying you hourly wages in one instance, but then when it came to cotton, they paid you by the weight to get more work out of you for less pay. Weekdays, you'd make 40 cents per hour for picking 100 pounds of cotton. And basically, that took the average person an entire day. And then on Saturdays, you'd be paid 50 cents for picking that same 100 pounds. So in order to make ends meet, everybody picked cotton. Children were pulled out of school to work to make ends meet. And the system was designed to force children into hard labor and out of their classrooms so that their families could survive. Regrettably, the laws at that time did not allow black people to sue white people, so there was no justice to remedy their complaints. I think my grandfather's story is important because what he did was dangerous. Here you have a black farmer testifying at a congressional hearing about the plight of black farmers in the rural South, the same Jim Crow South, the KKK South, the lawless South. He was a man of resolve, a man of purpose who didn't want a handout. He just wanted to be treated like a human being, a person to be valued, and he wanted to receive justice. And I will say at some point, my grandfather thought it was best for his family to leave the rural South. He tried to stay and make a go of it, but it became increasingly difficult to live under conditions where you were working from sunup until sundown with nothing to show for your labor. Yes, the game was rigged to keep you from being self-sufficient. It was just another way to get free labor from black families after the abolition of slavery. Yes, I would say there was plenty to be angry about. What is fascinating is that people in history who have the most valid reasons to be angry don't seem to be the angriest people. Black and brown people in this country are not the preponderance of mass shootings or domestic terrorism, yet we're labeled the threat. History has falsely labeled black people as an angry people, and when you label people, it sets them up to be treated differently. It is absolute insanity to expect someone to welcome mistreatment, to accept being talked down to be criticized and overly critiqued because of the color of their skin. But the question has to be asked of the perpetrators of violence against black and brown people: what are you so angry about? We know what our reasons are. What are yours? Just imagine for a moment the degree of anger one has to have that allows them to keep their knees on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. For anyone who suffers from asthma or COPD, just 30 seconds of being unable to breathe is horrifying. I once had an allergic reaction that affected my breathing, and I was terrified. There is no worse sensation than being unable to breathe, none that I can recall. And in researching the length of time it actually takes someone to die from hanging, it takes from seconds to minutes, because the hangman's noose is designed to fracture the neck, leaving the victim gasping for air until they die. Oh, wait a minute, I'm confused, because we don't kill people like that anymore, although there are still three states in the U.S. that still permit hanging. So wrap your arms around that. I witnessed what could only be compared that day watching television to a hanging. But what is most disturbing is that there was no attempt to end the suffering quickly. Thus, 8 minutes and 46 seconds only intensified the cruelty of that act. I don't know what fuels this much anger, and I never want to. I love the illustration of a quote from Arthur Louis L'Amour: "Anger is a killing thing. It kills the man who angers, for each rage leaves him less than he had before. It takes something from him." Many of you may be familiar with the Marvel character, the Hulk. Each time David Banner would lose his temper, he would turn into that green monster. And over time, it became increasingly difficult for him to change back. This transformation is further complicated when there is no foreseeable consequence for the conduct of the angry person. The prevalence in a society where black men are negatively profiled and killed like dogs in the streets only serves as a recruitment tool for vigilantes to join the ranks of police officers so they can shoot their guns and show the world how powerful they are. The sad part is that we have a system that allows it. The definition of resolve is finding a solution to a problem. Colin Kaepernick is the face of resolve in this time of history. In the fall of 2016, Colin chose to peacefully protest the treatment of black males succumbing to police violence by initially refusing to stand for the national anthem. He then progressed to taking a knee and was immediately met with anger, starting a national debate about his level of patriotism. You see, that's how racism works. The dominant culture has the power to hijack the conversation, to demand that you answer the question that you never really even asked. Fans threatened to discontinue attending games, wearing the Nike brand, and team owners colluded to keep him from working. Remember earlier when I shared that one of the crimes for lynching black people in the Jim Crow South was due to folks not knowing their station or failing to show submission? This man was publicly disgraced because he dared to stand up to systemic oppression. His colleagues were also threatened that if they supported his actions, they too would face the same wrath that he did. Everyone at one time or another has expressed strong feelings of anger because this is America. I recently told a friend that I still believe that this is the greatest place on earth to live, but our democracy is being tested by those who have allowed their anger and their prejudice to label black and brown people as animals, just like the Bandura experiment labeled those subjects. And it's this practice of labeling that has allowed people to dehumanize us and treat us with a level of antagonism that's deadly. People across the globe may sit and wonder when the U.S. will embody the values upon which it was founded. History will note that we were laggers, not leaders, in the area of civil rights and human rights, because we are still reconciling the rights and freedoms of black people in 2020, just like we were in the Jim Crow South. I'd now like to share some statistics taken from the New York Times bestseller, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. In DiAngelo's book, it speaks about racism and how it's practiced by good people. She underscores the emotional roller coaster for both white and black Americans around the subject of race and how polarizing these discussions can be. The statistics in this chart are about 4 years old, but it gives you a clear picture of where power rests in the United States. The black church continues to be the only institution where we participate in and control those resources. Sure, we participate in sports and in the entertainment industries, but we do not have ownership or the power we should based on our participation levels in these industries. In 1865, black folks received 40 acres and a mule. At today's value, that should equal about $6.4 trillion. Sadly, economists say that the average black family would need 228 years to build the wealth of a white family today. If our only plan is to get rid of policing, that's not a plan, because when I hear people talk about defunding police or getting rid of them, I think, what? Privatization of policing? Isn't that what George Zimmerman was? You know, the security guard who killed Trayvon Martin? And aren't some of the prisons privatized? Which means they only profit when people are inside of them. Where's the incentive to release folks? Now, if it's our plan to get rid of bad police, I'm on board with that. Improve recruitment, I'm on board with that. But at some point, we have to acknowledge that we need more plans. Equality has to extend beyond changing policing. There has to be changes in employment opportunities and advancement, changes in our philosophy of mass incarceration, improvements in housing, increased corporate board appointments, more CEO appointments, more diversity in senior executive leadership roles, incentives for diversity in economics and small business development, resources aimed at wealth education and building, active involvement from the church. And I would also suggest that we start asking all these businesses that are so sympathetic to show us their EEO-1 reports, which would show the number of minorities and women in positions of authority. So how do we demonstrate resolve so that we can move this mountain called racism? By peacefully protesting, by registering to vote and then actually doing it, by showing up for school board meetings, by refusing to spend our dollars with businesses or business owners who are overtly racist, working with our leaders to inform and change policies that systematically marginalize people, committing to excellence, not supporting organizations who do not practice diversity and inclusion in senior leadership roles. Now I'm just going to leave this slide right here. I was just speaking with one of my beloved doctoral professors the other day, and we were in agreement that Sunday was the most segregated day of the week. It is absolute hypocrisy if the church does not lead in matters of creating an inclusive society, and I believe that we have failed in this regard. I can't say that I love Jesus and live a life not caring about how my brother lives, or better yet, how he dies. Judgment won't just be about what we spoke up about. We will also have to give account for what we were silent about. Did I talk more than I listened? Did I move out of the safety and comfort of my pew into the world to talk and confront racism and how it hurts all of us? For me and my house, we choose resolve. We resolve to call out racism in whatever form it manifests itself. We resolve to be slow to anger, but more willing to listen and understand. We resolve to get citizens registered to vote and then actually go to the polls, run for office, write our legislators, peacefully protest, and keep on talking until the world listens and then the world changes. Because one day, it will no longer be okay to have to advise our children about the woes of being black in the park, wearing hoodies, being black after dark, black while driving through certain neighborhoods, black while grilling, while shopping, while standing, while peacefully protesting, or while running without a weapon with your back turned to the police. We won't be disrespected by legislators who imply we are unclean and catch COVID-19 disproportionately because we don't wash our hands. And we won't support people who look like us but don't articulate our interests. One day, we will be able to enjoy the presumption of innocence instead of the assumption of guilt. Because if we don't get this right, this great experiment that we call democracy will be a failure, because we will have shown that democracy was conditional, that love was conditional, that belonging was conditional, and that breathing was conditional.